Hello, everybody, and welcome to Caoilinn in Conversation, where Caoilinn Hughes seeks out the finest writers from the UK and Ireland and chats with them about their novels and life in general. We cannot thank Caoilinn enough for the incredible array of writers that she has had on this series over the last couple of years, and today is no different. Caoilinn's guest today is Bette Adriaanse, who is a writer and an artist. Her first novel, Rust Like Everyone Else, was published by Unnamed Press in 2015, and her second novel, What's Mine, came out a week ago for Unnamed as well. Congratulations, Bette. Bette writes in both English and Dutch and is co-founder of the, I'm just going to say these letters out, TRQSE Foundation, an international network for artists, scientists, people in media and business who want to work together on projects with a social element. She is also co-founder of the Heroines movement. Our host, as always, is Caoilinn Hughes, whose most recent novel, The Wild Laughter, won the 2021 Royal Society of Literature's Encore Award and was short and long listed for a number of other very prestigious awards and is an Exile favorite. Her highly anticipated new novel, The Alternatives, releases out into the wild in the spring of 2024 from Riverhead, which means, fingers crossed, that we may finally get to meet Caoilinn in person next year. Before we get started, I would ask those of you tuning in this afternoon to please mute yourselves, but keep your cameras on so that our guests don't feel like they're speaking into a void. Type any questions you might have into the chat, and Caoilinn will ask them of Bette around the 45-minute mark. You can purchase copies of both What's Mine and The Wild Laughter through the link in the chat, or go to exileandbookville.com. Both will come with signed book plates. It should be noted that we ship throughout the US. Before I step away, please help me in welcoming Bette Adriaanse and Caoilinn Hughes. Enjoy the show, everyone.
Thank you, Javier. Thank you. Congratulations, Bette. This is your official book launch. The book came out last week, and it is a gorgeous object as well as a gorgeous book. So it's just nice to kind of take a moment to acknowledge the birthing of this of this beauty. It's such an honor to get to celebrate the launch with you. I came across Bette's writing first in the Netherlands when I was teaching at Maastricht University, but I was at a live literary journal. It's a very, very cool event called Verso, and that's associated with a literary magazine in the Netherlands. And I heard Bette reading from her first novel at that event, and I just knew immediately I wanted to be friends. and then my ticket to friendship was inviting Bette to come and speak to my students at Maastricht, and I just also knew that it was going to be such a gift to the students, because I think something that aspiring writers often struggle with is the feeling of their voice not being distinctive enough, or it not being possible to sound both kind of true to yourself, but also very distinctive on the page as, you know, such and such a writer. To me, Bette's voice is so incredibly distinctive, while being just very, very simple on a certain level, but also it's such an achievement, because I mean, you could draw comparisons to people like Jonathan Koo or even Nikolai Gogol. I'm pretty sure that reading your work brought his work to mind, some of the humor, the kind of slant kind of angle on things, and the philosophical kind of bent throughout the work. It's always quizzical, and nothing is taken for granted, kind of no knowledge. Nothing is ever cliche in it, because if there's something that comes up that is expected, it then gets interrogated in some way. I don't know. It's part of the voice, but it's also the worldview of the writing that I find so distinctive. And I was thinking it would be nice to start by just for the people who are here who don't know your work, to hear a little snippet of it, and you can say whatever you would like to say to kind of help us understand the book.
Yes, I would very much like that. And thank you, Caoilinn. Thank you for having me. Thank you to Exile and Bookville for having me. I'm so happy that I get to celebrate with you and I get to be here. I love watching these conversations. So I'm thrilled to be on it, and with my friend Caoilinn. And I now know the origin story of our friendship, so that's nice as well. I'll start very early on in the book. So without giving too much away, I think it's fair to say that this book is about an unwanted guest. So the main character, Louise, lives in a house and he's busy redecorating, which he basically continuously is doing. And then somebody rings his doorbell. And at first he doesn't open the door, and finally he goes down to open the door. In the hallway Louise shared with his downstairs neighbor, Estelle, stood a tall man in a long green checkered coat, a scarf tucked into his collar. Rainwater was dripping from his head onto his shoulders. Estelle stood next to him. The front door was still open and the street lamps shone yellow on the wet pavement of Rooseveltlaan. "How do you do?" the man said, extending his hand. "I'm doing fine," Louise said. He hesitated, then held the man's thin, bony fingers between his for a moment. "Splendid," the man said. He had a British accent as he spoke Dutch, and his voice was soft, not much more than a whisper. He kept his head low, as if he didn't want to be noticed, but Louis thought that people who didn't want to be noticed did not ring people's doorbells at night. They did not wear hats or say, "Splendid." "My name is William Rose," the man said. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Louis Sol," Louis said. "Louis Sol," the man echoed. "Le Roi Soleil, the Sun King." "What?" Louis said. "He doesn't understand," Estelle said to the man. "Louis XIV? I'm assuming your mother chose your name as a play on the French Sun King," the man said. "My mother did not play," Louis said. He could feel his neck getting warm, the spots climbing up from under the collar of his shirt. "I know it's late," the man said with a smile, "and I do apologize for disturbing you at this hour. The fact is, my father and my mother used to live in your apartment when my mother was pregnant with me. I think I was born here, and I believe I have lived here for several years when I was a child." He looked at Louise as if he had just delivered fantastic news. "And it would mean a lot to me if I could have a look around." "Oh," Louise said. The word "oh" hung between them for a moment. Louise looked at this man called William Rose. There were 3 plastic bags filled with folders and papers sitting at his feet. Behind him stood a big suitcase. Water trickled from his coat onto the carpet in the hallway. Louise rubbed the back of his neck. "He came all the way from England to see your apartment," Estelle said. "Oh," Louise said again. He looked at Estelle. She had put her hand on the man's sleeve, apparently unbothered by the wet fabric. She had never touched Louise in the 8 years that they'd known each other. She'd always stayed at least an arm's length away from him. I'll leave it there.
Oh, it's that's got so much in it, that like arm's length. It's so long. There's such understated longing in that, and it's also so relatable. Just the idea that's, you know, you can almost tell straight away that there's so much more that the man wants of Louis, and you know, so he does have that emotional intelligence to be able to read through, you know, and read people, and maybe that's this visual person thing that I'm going to ask you about later. But I noticed that both this book and your first book, Rust Like Everyone Else, which came out in 2015, both of them kind of use as a catalyst someone knocking on the door. And so that almost feels like an archetypal, you know, situation, like you know, the dream of teeth falling out, the idea of someone knocking on the door, that you have some kind of and I mean, depending on the country and depending on whose door is being knocked on, the implications would be very different. And so I think we don't, you know, feel so much danger in either of the books about that knock on the door. But for, like, correct me if I'm wrong, to me it seems like in both novels, and certainly definitely in this one, the knocking on the door is kind of like a breaking of the fourth wall, so that the character can no longer just exist with that door closed. Was that the feeling that you kind of started off with the book, that somebody was kind of had created such a contained life, and that you needed to kind of interrupt it? Or was it like some kind of anxiety about what can happen when someone knocks on your door?
I think it's both. It's really nice that you point this out, because it's a story device as well. And I remember I had a teacher once, a really good teacher who I didn't always agree with, who said, I don't want to read any of your stories that start with the doorbell rang or he woke up, and I thought, all my stories start that way. And actually I quite like it, because it also just announces something's gonna happen. This is where the story starts. And I don't mind that. I feel like a painting where you can see the paint a little bit. I like that. Where you're looking at an artwork in the beginning, and then you slowly move in. And then the feeling that is central for me for this knock on the door is this feeling that I think is actually familiar to a lot of people, especially our generation. Why do we dislike it so much when our phone rings? Why are we a little bit scared when the doorbell rings? What are we hiding in our house? Are we afraid of other people? Are we hiding something? So, and I know that this isn't the case for everyone, but I do know it's a more common feeling than might be suggested by people saying, oh, it's the way to start a story by a knock on the door is a device. It's actually every time somebody rings your doorbell unexpected, there is a little bit of a story starting, right? I don't know how you feel when you don't expect somebody to ring your doorbell and then your doorbell rings.
That's such an interesting point. I'd never thought about that as being generational. You're quite right that the idea of, I'm always thinking of these Irish plays where it's a constant stream of different people arriving at the door. It's not just Irish plays. I think, anything kind of set like in the early 20th century or in mid 20th century, the constant stream of people coming, whether doctors and, visiting the house. And I had never really thought about that as being something that our generation has become more averse to.
Yeah, I think so. I've observed it with my grandma, for instance. She reacted to the doorbell the way she would react to me saying her name. I would say grandma, she would be like, oh. And if the doorbell rings, she's like, oh, the doorbell. And then, or she'd keep the door open. And she was not hiding in her house. So our generation does that a bit more. And I just thought it was really interesting. Like, if you use your house as a hiding place, what are you hiding from, and how much are you feeling at home actually in this larger community that your house is in and your position in it? So there's a lot of big questions that are connected to that feeling when the doorbell rings. So that's what happens in the book when Luis's doorbell rings, is that he instinctively bends his head. And to me, that's really saying a lot about who he is. His instinct is to withdraw and to retreat. So I also just want to know when I start a story, so okay, so what will happen to you, Luis, this character that I already love, when this invasion starts? How will you handle it?
Mm-hmm. And it's even though he is kind of cowering and doesn't kind of take up a lot of space, he's very particular in his life, and seemingly takes pleasure from kind of having some sort of control over it. He also has these kind of like bravado gestures, like of having a completely white interior, white carpets, and it's like partly bachelor pad, but it's I suppose he comes from a working class laboring background, and so the dynamic, oddly enough, the person who the novel opens with somebody looking up from the street level into this lit up apartment, and oddly the roles are reversed. The person who's on the street is an Oxford professor, who is the son of or purportedly the son of a philanthropist, and so their classes are very different, so the roles are kind of have been switched. So I suppose immediately kind of the novel is interested in privilege, and upsetting that in some way, or poking a stick at it.
Yeah, I think so too, and I'm having a lot of fun with just these notions of what is good taste and what is intelligence. So Louis has a lot of white marble. He lifts weights. He's very muscled. He takes his cues from a friend, Haji, who tells him, this is what girls will like. That is what girls will like. And he's just trying to be an acceptable person. He's just trying to be good. And he decides that having an all white interior is good, having a big flat screen TV is good, and he's unaware that how that might be perceived by people from different layers of society. And then in a way I'm poking fun more at the fact that why is it classy to wear an old coat and a hat? Like, why is that a good thing? Why I just find that so funny that if you buy a really old car and you convert it, and then it's classy, and then if you buy a new car, it's flashy.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing is good and the other thing is bad. And if you buy a Rothko painting, it's good in some social spheres, but if you marble your whole house, it's bad. And I just think that's really funny how we agree on those rules, and how why do we look at things that way? So I was trying to just have fun with that and just flip it around as much as I could, and also examine myself in the process. What are my prejudices that I have for.
Yeah. I mean, there are so many interesting insights in the book into just very relatable thoughts, but that most people don't necessarily, or how can I know what most people do? but surely some people don't really interrogate that much, like even just little things like how Louis notices, sorry, it's the French pronunciation I'm trying to get my head around. He notices how dirty the man is, and also his mother, who'd been a cleaner, who'd been cleaning in the apartment of this man, noticed how dirty the wealthy were, and how in her upbringing she'd been told, to have a bowl on the counter means poverty, to have a stain on your jeans means poverty, and this kind of long list of examples. And it's such the idea of poverty as a kind of curse word used in her upbringing is it's so affecting. Anyway, just to say that's also rich, that all of that kind of commentary on class isn't the right way to put it. I just observations, I think, and showing the way that people who are from different social spheres, when they come together, they make one another realize certain things about themselves. So one of the kind of largest interruption in the book is Louis's perspective on this house as being something he takes a huge amount of pride in, maybe that he never thought that he really deep down had a right to own something like this and to get to live there, and this way of keeping it pristine that kind of exemplifies that. And so we have like this public versus private, or private versus public property, a private property ownership versus some kind of shared alternative mode of owning property. And it's one of the biggest kind of topics in the book, and also it's probably one of the biggest issues of our generation. I don't know the stats for the Netherlands, but in Ireland, if you're over 40, 80% of people own property, but if you're under 40, it's less than 30%. So it's a, you know, just now, maybe when it seems like it's not viable to continue aspiring to own property, just now we're starting to think about, well, is it a right? Is that a, you know, a fundamental human right to own property, or just to have shelter and to have, you know, and so I wonder how you, if this to you was this kind of the starting point of the book, and also how you did your research for it. You know, did you read a lot of nonfiction books? And if you did, were they kind of philosophical books, or were they more social histories? I'm really curious as to how you kind of developed your thinking on that.
I'm very glad you asked, because I did so much research for this book, and so much, and I don't think anything ended up in the book in the end. You know, you just gather information and it doesn't belong in the story in the end. But I did learn a lot. So I read a lot of anthropology. So how do people share in different cultures? How do people live together? There's cultures where all women share a hut and all men share a hut, and they sleep together every night in rows. And they have plenty of space and resources to do it differently, but that's how they enjoy it and how they're used to doing things. I've researched the notion of public property. So what do we actually own as people, aside from our own possessions? What do we own together? The squares and the streets, but also the atmosphere, which is really interesting that we never think about, that we own the atmosphere and it's being completely polluted at the moment. So what else do we own aside from the house? And as I was writing the book, I didn't really have views to start out when I wrote the book. I'm not the type of writer who has a really strong view on things or clear opinions, sadly.
I think that does the novel a huge service. I mean, there's nothing worse than starting a novel and knowing that the author has opinions.
Yeah, it would, then you just have to write an opinion piece, I guess. But I'm more the type of writer who learns stuff as I go, and even now that it's finished. And as I started out with this notion of home and what are you entitled to? How much can you have for yourself? How can you be safe in society? And how can you also share with other people, especially a house? How many square meters are you entitled to? And then I started realizing that the notion of home, your house as a home, is so narrow. And I started realizing this feeling that Louise has, that this startled when the doorbell rings, this uncertainty, that I recognize this and I see it in a lot of people. And that is because for many people, our communities, our city doesn't really feel like home. So our house is a refuge, and it becomes really important to have one. And then you decorate it exactly the way you want, and you do everything to make your space your sanctuary, and then you go out in the street to your job, or on the tube or the metro with all the other people, and then you sort of shield. And at work, you behave and you adhere to all the rules, and then you go back home again, and then you relax again, and then you watch Netflix, read a book. And I realized if you expand this notion of home to more of the outside world, to your entire community, even the community maybe that your community is in, and if you could have a sense of safety there, even, like I think maybe my grandma had, that's why she wasn't scared of the doorbell, then how important is the house actually? So, and I've been linking that to all these notions of actually the public space. We own the public space, but we don't think about it that much. At least, like you said before, we don't know what other people think. Maybe everybody's thinking about squares all the time and how they're decorated, but I don't. So since doing the research, I've been thinking about that a lot more, about my own my property, the atmosphere, the streets, the squares, the sea.
The sound even, you know, that's something my partner goes absolutely mad about with people with mopeds, you know, it's that it's sound pollution, and that we actually have a right not to hear that. You know, it's very hard to enforce, but it's something I think a lot of people wouldn't even know that you have a right not to hear that.
No, and I think also the question of what do you want in regards to sound is a question that it seems all set in stone and settled, you know, there's just noise and these are the noises that we hear. But just asking yourself the question of what do I think is a good idea for sound? You know, what would I like to happen to the atmosphere or even outer space? You know, I'm going way off topic now, but they're now talking about mining asteroids, meteorites. And so private companies want to mine resources from outer space. It's our property, outer space, that we put that down in a law that it's our shared property and nobody owns it. We all own it together. So what do we want with that? Do we want people to be doing that? How do we want them to do that? So it's really exciting to suddenly have way more stuff and to think about, you know, what do I want with that? So to me, that's really got me away from this notion of the house and your objects in it. And more
I'm glad that it got you up. That could equally get you down, thinking about the kind of avaricious nature of humans being like mine, like the seagulls. I can't remember what animation that was. Kind of just going around going mine. But
yeah, I remember that one. Well, you know, there's also, yeah, I've done way too much research, Caoilinn, and so you're touching on all of that, and it didn't end up in the book at all. But that's also quite interesting, the ideas that we have about what human nature is. And then if you look at all these different peoples around the world throughout history, they've had really different relationships with the environment and also with owning things. And, you know, this notion of giving back, not taking more than you need and giving back when you take something and keeping track of what you take and treating everything in the environment as a living entity with rights. You know, if we would be a culture with those kinds of ideas, we wouldn't be mining all over the place in the way that we're doing. Yeah. So it's, in that sense, it's uplifting. You know, if you dig deep enough, you'll find uplifting stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, there is that perspective in the novel, at least from some of the characters, that the law is a force for good, or at least, you know, a force for reckoning with what our beliefs are, rather than having default, you know, beliefs that we don't really interrogate, you know, and that's a very interesting kind of position to take in life. Maybe that's too much to go into it here, but one of the areas that it comes up very specifically in the book is around inheritance, and the rights of inheritance, and I mean, it's there kind of philosophically, but it's also there very pragmatically in the book. And there is a story of quite an atypical inheritance scenario. So not, you know, descendants of a family, and it brings up the questions of when is inheritance like acceptable, or what form of inheritance is somehow seen as being more proper than others, and you know, and sometimes that inheritance is kind of, we have these moral blind spots where we kind of think, well, if children care for their elderly parents, then inheriting is a form of kind of, you know, payment for that, but then it's taxed differently. It's so interesting. Is that another rabbit hole that you went down, thinking about inheritance?
Definitely. And it's very different in different societies. So I'm now in the US, and if you think about all these billionaires who have gathered so much money, and then that's one thing, you know, to be in your lifetime, get a lot of money for yourself. It's another thing to pass it on to your kids, and then instead of it being taxed. I mean, I don't want to talk too much about what I think they should do in the US because it's not my place at all. But it's a strange notion that as people get older, as they're turning 90 and 100, all this wealth is then passed on to people who are 60 or 70, who then, you know, sit on it or buy boats. While it could also go towards, I don't know, healthcare. So that's that's one thing. That's a very practical way of thinking about it. And then there's a different way of thinking about it that was actually much harder for me to think about, which is we inherit culturally in our country the wealth of our country. So the Netherlands has been very entrepreneurial, going all over the world, stealing a lot, basically. And we're a very wealthy country, and I've inherited this. And even doesn't matter if your parents are poor or middle class, the schools are nice, the hospitals are good, and that's part of our inheritance of our ancestors. And then there's this notion of, okay, you inherit the good stuff. Do you also inherit some of the responsibilities? Do you also inherit some of the guilt or the flaws? You know, it's said in the law that you cannot inherit crimes or punishments, which I think is a good thing. So, but, you know, just morally or philosophically, if you inherit from somebody, is it interesting to look at how they got it? And that's actually, I think, the central question in this book. So Luis has inherited the apartment, and he, at least he thinks so, and he's never questioned how his mother got it. And the same goes for his visitor, William, who has never questioned how his father got rich. So they both want the inheritance, but do they also want the whole story?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's such a great premise, and while to me it feels like very Dutch in the sense, something about living in close proximity in the Netherlands makes you kind of very aware of the property, you know, the environment that you're living in, and the environment that the person in the house beneath, you know, the Beneden house, and that, you know, so people kind of do live in a certain way where there's almost some inevitability of knowing your neighbor, and having a kind of story, having some insight into, yeah, whether people own their own house, you know, whether it was belonged to the family who lived there before, but it certainly got, I mean, it's absolutely universal, all of the questions that are in the book as well, but I think it manages to be both. It manages to both be really fascinating on a Dutch level, but also absolutely universal. One of the things, you know, that the characters are kind of outsiders also, but you just mentioned how that, you know, we have, you mentioned two of the perspectives that we actually have many perspectives in the book, and that was true of your last book as well. And I think that that's something that really speaks to the philosophy of the book. You know, it's I wonder, was that always the case when you started writing it? Did you know that it was going to be a poly vocal book, and because that creates a non hierarchy, you know, in the kind of power dynamics of the book as well.
I really like, if I write something longer, to have this multitude of voices of all these different experiences. I think also because I go into it with a question but not an answer. I'm gathering all these different viewpoints and experiences, and I'm just letting them talk. And then as they go along and they fight and argue with each other, I'm starting to get a sense of, oh, that person actually has a point, or I'm starting to feel what this person is feeling. And so I'm learning about the topic as I continue, and it's something that I admire in my favorite writers a lot. Like you mentioned Gogol before, and I really like his fantastic realism. And the writer who is my huge example on this multitude of voices thing, whose writing I will never get close to, is Dostoevsky. His way of bringing in all these different perspectives, and then through a very compelling story, just taking you on a tour of all these different perspectives and slowly resolving the conflicts.
Mm-hmm. And showing how the society is kind of built up as well, even if it's a very local society to just one house or one street. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, I keep it very small for my sake. And I think, you do the same in your books as well, don't you? You introduce many different perspectives and from different social spheres as well, I think.
Yeah, maybe more in the short stories than in the 2 novels that are out. But in the next novel, there's four central voices, and that's kind of new for me. And I found it really liberating, because you don't have the same pressure of, you know, and kind of claustrophobia of one person's perspective on the progression, you know, on how we reverse narrativize our lives, and, you know, pick out the moments that we think are significant, even if it's in, you know, a distant third person. I think there's still that selection. We still feel kind of controlled as a reader, and I think as soon as you have many voices, it's like, it feels much fairer on the reader.
And you get less sick of yourself as well. You can have somebody, just if you have a character that you really love, but then at some point he's just so annoying, and he just she or they just, you know, get up and do something. You can have another character who has totally different personality and say,
yeah,
get up and do something.
yeah.
It's nice.
And I think you live in that kind of polyvocal way as well. I won't make it too personal, but, you know, you've lived in lots of different places, and you speak many different languages, and so I think that it's part of your kind of worldview that comes through in the books, that you're interested in the you don't come across as a writer who has a one very set experience of life that's being portrayed very well and beautifully. It feels much more kind of feral in a way that that I love. I'm really drawn to, you know, people who kind of don't belong, or don't, you know, or for one reason or another, whether it's by choice or not by choice, end up kind of not having a narrative that makes very much sense, you know, speaking English in a way that you can't really tell what the mother tongue is, or and I did love that about living in the Netherlands, is that the English as a second language, it was so many languages actually, and the way that it's spoken by people of different backgrounds, it's not the same, and you can hear, you know, that it's not got the same origin. Anyway, I'm going off the point now, and and there's many questions that I have, way too many for the time we have left, so I'm going to make sure that I get around to I'll ask you one more. I have so many that I want to ask. I'll ask you one more before I go and look, and I think there's a question in the chat, and if anyone in the audience does want to ask questions, do put them there. I shouldn't be hierarchical about who gets to ask. So the protagonist of this novel, What's Mine, describes himself as a visual person, and this is kind of put in your blurb about the book, so it's obviously important. You're a visual artist. You trained at the Image and Language Department at the Gerrit Rietveld Fine Art Academy in Amsterdam, and now you teach at the Art Academy. I went to see one of your students' exhibitions there, which was so cool. And I'd love to hear your perspective on this visual person thing. I would guess that most visual artists are like visual people, but that not all writers are. I think there are some writers who kind of find description very difficult, and they're much more comfortable when they're sitting within kind of inner interiority, you know, and any kind of visual aspects read like awkward kind of stage directions. So I wonder whether that yeah, well, what your perspective on this visual person thing is.
It's a good question. I thought, for me, the visual person aspect wasn't so remarkable. It's just Louis was a visual person, and he's my main character. I feel close to him, the way he experiences the world, and then the readers really picked up on it. So the early readers are the editors and agents, and they, to them, it really stood out as something fun about Louise. And I realized it's an interesting thing to highlight, and also to have highlighted by others, that this visual person is not very dominant in society, because society is dominated by words. The law is words, and all of our news is words. And if you're good with words, you also, if you're a good reader, people think you're intelligent. And then in art school, you're surrounded by visual people. And the Dutch art school where I used to study and also taught, you can get into art school without having a proper high school diploma. So, which I think is really nice. I think it's not the case in the UK. So those visual people who really struggle with books or with words or making long sentences, they can get in and they can show their kind of intelligence. And for me, Luis is a person like that. He really loves art. He has emotional intelligence. He picks up on a lot of things that happen in the room, people changing postures, changing tone of voice, but he's completely helpless in regards to words. And I thought that was just a really nice perspective to have in a book. And I'm not a writer who, I cannot describe an apple so well that you can taste it, or sometimes I get these notes from my editors, like, can you say this more subtle? Like, no, I can't. It's just, this is me. This is my outer limit of what I can do. The doorbell rang. He opened the door. There was a man there. That's how I write. And I guess I am a visual person, but the words are my tool to build that visual world. Mm-hmm. And it works, and people have tolerated it. So I guess I'm getting away with it, but I am very weirdly a visual person, posing as a writer.
Well, you know, you're doing both. You're doing both. And you are right. You are kind of, that is part of the worldview of the books as well, that we kind of get access to somebody who doesn't. It's not a typical. There's nothing typical about it. You know, that's what I find so fascinating. It kind of reads, and it has a simplicity in the reading, but it's also not. You haven't read it before, you know. So there's something in that, I think, being a visual person and accidentally also writing novels. But I'm going to ask a little question that's in the chat here, but it's a very short question from Leslie Campbell, a writer who I've met and know. Thanks, Leslie, for coming. She's asked, just what about Estelle? So it's kind of a cryptic question.
It's a good question. What about Estelle? So there's a character it's Louis' neighbor, Estelle. She's a lawyer, and she drives a mint green Mini to her law firm each day, and she has really nice nails that are always in this shade of pink, polished to perfection. And she's very capable in the world. She's successful, and she has decided to help William. So she's, from the moment he arrived and he said he was an Oxford professor, she took the side of William against her longtime neighbor, Louise, who has a hideous marble nameplate that she doesn't like and has fluorescent lights that shine on her tree and stuff. So she takes sides with William, and I hope that I've also shown some human side to Estelle in the book, that why she is that way. I hope so. I don't know. Reader's gonna have to tell me.
Yeah, no, it's immediately, she's a very useful character to the reader, because we immediately know that, well, Louise can't be that great a neighbor if she's immediately siding with some stranger.
Yeah, and he isn't. He isn't. You know, he really wants contact with her, but he's not entitled to it. So and he makes a mess. And Estelle is also one of those reality check characters. When you read a book like this, very soon you'll be thinking as a reader, like, so what about the law? What about the paperwork? You know, you can talk so much about who inherited what, but you can also look it up. So Estelle is the person who says, let's look it up. Mm-hmm. So she's my reality check character, I guess.
Gotcha. The title of the novel, so you did your own translation into Dutch, is that correct? So cool.
Yeah, it's not a translation. I just rewrote it from the visual data bank.
So you didn't take your English copy and then write it in Dutch?
No.
Wow.
Yeah, it sounds very complicated and unnecessary, but it's very helpful, actually. So, you know, when you make a painting, at some point you cannot really see what's wrong with it, and then there's this trick that painters have, is that they hang it upside down, and then they have this set of, we say in Dutch, fresh eyes. I don't know if you say that in English. Yeah. So you can look at it with a set of fresh eyes. You can suddenly see, like, oh, the composition is a little off and it needs a little bit of dark in that corner. So doing that with language, retelling a story from the beginning, you know, you must have also have this database of, you see your characters walking around, you see them arguing with each other and getting in the car and taking off. And so when you retell that story again in this other mode, this other language, which is also another personality, you have this set of fresh eyes. So for me, when I got stuck in the story, I had this amazing tool to, fresh eye tool, maybe.
So did you do that as you were writing the book in English? You were also, if you got stuck in English, then you would go and write something in Dutch?
Yeah, usually I would either continue in Dutch. So if I got stuck in English, I would continue with the characters in Dutch. Or if I thought this chapter is just like blabbing on, I would write it again in the other language. In Dutch, I'm more precise and more short. And in English, I'm more daring and free.
Wow, that's so cool. The title in Dutch is what van mine is, and from like the little Dutch that I know that that's not an equivalent to what's mine. That was always something that's actually kind of a tricky thing when you're learning Dutch to adjust to. That you can't say you know, Paul's shoes. You have to say the shoes of Paul. And it changes the dynamic. We have a kind of some equivalent thing in the Irish language where, you know, you can't say I'm sorry. You have to say I have sorrow upon me. And so it creates a different sense of, like, actually it's a different way of thinking about ownership or having in Dutch. Is that something that you know that you're conscious of when you're speaking, like when as a kid, or when you learn English and you realize you don't have to construct it the same way? It's such
I
a
think
small thing.
when you're starting a new language, as a child, you just pick up the words and you pick up the way of saying things. And you don't think so much about the meaning of how you say it. But then when you do actual translation, you really realize it, that in English you can say, taking a deep breath, she looked at her new garden or something. And you can't say it in Dutch. You have to say, she took a deep breath while she was looking at the garden, or she took a deep breath and looked at the garden. So suddenly it's two things. It's not somebody doing both things at once. So you get this really choppy language like this, which is very Dutch. And it's also our personality as the Dutch, to be very straightforward and kind of make things as clear as possible. So I think your language shapes your personality. And I know you've been learning Italian. So do you have a different personality in Italian?
Yeah, I do. I sound like my 20-year-old self, and like I sound all flirty and coy. It's very weird. I can't but I did, so I was told that by my German translator for my first book, but to explain, I said, how is it like 150 pages longer? And he said, because, Caoilinn, we can't say dreaming of the following day she looked out the window. He said we can't do that. We have to make it 2 sentences. So that must be the same with German and Dutch. But you said that the Dutch translation of this book is way shorter.
It's way shorter, and that's not a language thing. That is a culture thing. So it's just, it's this personality in language. If I would tell the same story of something that happened as I was fishing to an American person, I have way more liberty to add details and exaggerate a little bit. And in Dutch, and I'm generalizing a lot now, and I'm sure many Dutch people would disagree, but it's my experience that the Dutch are way more to the point. So if I would say, it was amazing, I was in the middle of the lake, and before suddenly this incredible thing happened, a Dutch person would not tolerate this generalizing. They'd be in the middle of the lake, where you're really in the center of the lake. It's incorrect. You just know it's incorrect because you were not in the middle of the lake. Was it amazing? Was it really amazing? Or was it just nice or, exciting? So that's really interesting. And I think that's how the Dutch book got so short, because there's just been a lot of cutting to get to the point. Well, the American book has more detours and thoughts and explanations.
Yeah. It's still
Yeah.
not a long book. It's still a short. It's a short book. It's a lovely length. There's loads of things I want to ask, and I know we're going to run out of time. And there's a question in the chat I'm going to get to after one more. A point. This isn't a question, and this is a comment to say that anyone who's listening should go and read. Bette has just published an amazing essay, actually amazing, not just fine. Sorry, that's a callback. In LitHub, and partly it's about some of the themes that are in the book, but it's also touches on starting a book while you're poor, and then ending a book rich, or relatively rich, and there's some brilliant thinking in the essay about privilege, and it is just such a fascinating essay. I know people often publish essays when books come out, and often they're they paraphrase something of the book in not as interesting a way, but that's not the case for this essay, so I really recommend reading it. But one thing before I'm going to this question in the chat is, you have some events coming up, and I think one tomorrow, about radical sharing, and so can you tell us a little bit about that and what that means to you?
For sure. Thank you for bringing that up. So the event tomorrow, it's actually more of a regular book event. So that's the book launch in LA. Everybody's invited. It's at North Figueroa bookstore with this really great writer, Gallagher Lawson. And then afterwards in San Francisco at the Long Now Foundation, I've organized an event called Radical Sharing. And it has different speakers talking about their relationship with the ideas of property and sharing. And these speakers are all people who actually do something. So there's a scientist who is redefining property rights. There's an activist artist who is all about sharing resources, has started a library. So it's a very positive event, just showcasing new thinking about different ways of living together. And it really ties in with this idea that developed as I was writing the book of how can we be at ease in our communities if inequality is growing, which it is, social cohesion is lessening, and we are less safe. And it doesn't matter on which side of that equation you are, it just sucks. It's bad. And there's many people who are actually trying to do something about that. So instead of me talking about the book, I thought I'll just showcase some of these projects and these people who are really good at talking about it. So I can also share a bit on the research that I've done, and also the lessons I've learned from writing the book to actually do something with it, not just bring it out in the world or tweet my opinion or something, but actually do something.
Yeah, and Bette does a lot of brilliant things. She runs and she's a co-founder of Turquoise, which is what Javier was reading out at the start. A Turquoise Foundation, which is an international network of artists and scientists, people in the media and in business, who are working together on quite varied projects, and one of the projects within that is the Heroines movement, which is trying to create diverse, not trying to, accomplishing creating very diverse female role models for young people. And there's a book already in the Netherlands for that, and there's that is working with women all over the world to help bring kind of projects together, whether it's books or like school packages, and it's a really fabulous project, and that sits within the Turquoise Foundation, and I'm sure that there's going to be all sorts of amazing projects in the future. So huge kudos.
Thank you for mentioning that. It's a really wonderful project that also emerged as I was writing this book, and I work with incredible people who I've co-founded this foundation with, and we have a really great team, mostly volunteers. and it's been a real joy to actually do things and, you know, try to do positive things in the world. So
Brilliant.
yeah, so it's a good thing that came out of this writing this book as well. Wanting to take action and doing it in a way that's hopefully useful.
Yeah, amazing. There's a question from Cray Vuist, saying, would you recommend me to read the Dutch version too after having read the English? I mean, would it give extra depth to the story for anybody who could do that?
Yes, I would recommend it because well, I know this specific person is a writer, so it will also be really interesting for me to hear her opinion on the two different versions. But I think it's worth reading both because it's highlighting different parts of the story, and especially if you're a writer, or if you're interested in narratives and how stories are created and evolved, I think it's interesting to see the difference. The essence of the story is the same. So if I would be telling you about this fight that I got in at my Christmas dinner, I would tell Caoilinn the same story in English as I would tell someone else in Dutch. But it would be differently told, but you would hear the same story twice, you know, I wouldn't be changing the crucial details. So that's important to know. Like you won't learn any new things.
It's not a secret different ending or something.
No, there's a couple of tiny differences in focus and nuance, but it's really just like as if people tell the same story 5 years later, or to a different audience.
Yeah. Brilliant. I'm sure there's tonal things as well in how you write. I will bring it to a close here and invite Javier back in for some housekeeping. But it's been such a pleasure talking to you, Bette. It's a gorgeous book, and you're so fascinating. I could have listened to you and talked with you, especially throughout COVID at length. And Bette was very much responsible for keeping my spirits up and helping me through the start of the next novel. You said Bette gave me this analogy about, because I was complaining that the novel that I had in me was not the novel that I wanted to write, because it was going to be really hard and it was going to take ages. And I was like, I just want an easier, shorter novel. And Bette was like, but Caoilinn, you have something in your garden. And no matter how ugly it is and how thorny and how poisonous and how hard it is to maintain, you have something in your garden and you have to go and show up to it and tend to it. And then if in the end, you know, that's all it was this plant that had this life, and you put it aside, then something else can grow there. But if you don't do that, nothing else can grow. And so it was that kind of like, that actually was an encouragement to go and find a reason to turn up for the thorny, poisonous thing in the garden. It meant a lot.
That's so nice to hear. Thank you. I'm very glad that while I'm babbling, some good stuff also pops up.
Oh, that was great. Thank you, guys. That was actually rather brilliant. You guys were fantastic. Again, Caoilinn, wonderful presentation. You always come prepared. And Bette, you guys are old friends, as you are. We thank you all for coming here today. I did have one question before we go for the both of you. And just because it's that time of the year, we're going to fall. Are there any books that you're excited about coming in the fall?
That's a really good question. I'm very biased because I love my publisher, Unnamed Press. Mm-hmm. And they have a couple of really great books that have just come out, so it's just nearing the fall. So Under Jungle and Housewoman. I'm thrilled about Caoilinn's book, but I don't know when it's coming out. Alternatives.
The spring.
In the spring.
Oh, my mind always goes blank. The last thing I just finished reading was Catherine Lacey's biography of X.
Oh yeah.
And that is so good and so different to I mean, it's such an ambitious project, and I think it really executes those ambitions really well. So that's just out now. I know in the fall, one of the earlier interviewees for this series was Louise Kennedy for her novel Trespasses, and she's got a short story collection coming out in the US in the fall, and that short story collection, it's called The End of the World is a Cul-de-sac, and that came out first in the UK, and the UK and Ireland, and that's what actually garnered her fan base, especially among writers. So it's I'm really interested to see whether it lands, you know, with American readers. But yes, as soon as we hang up now, about 50 books will come into my mind.
I'm that way as well. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but thank you all for coming, and you can purchase signed copies of What's Mine and Wild Laughter. We will ship them out all over the US. Thank you all for coming again, and thank you two for such a wonderful conversation. And I think we will see you next time.
Thanks, folks. Thanks so much, Javier and Kristen and Bette.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really wonderful. Thank you both.
And good luck, Bette, on the